Without me, she'd be sleeping in her car. My father said it like a punchline, leaning back in the witness chair like he owned the courtroom the way he owned everything else in his life. The judge looked up from her file, then looked at me, and something in her face shifted. "So your family genuinely has no idea?" she asked. My father's lawyer frowned. "No idea about what, Your Honor?" The judge set down her glasses. "She's the one who holds the mortgage on his dealership. My name is Marguerite, I'm 37, and 4 days earlier I had quietly become the legal owner of the building my father was standing in to evict me from. Before I get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had a family member underestimate you right up until the moment it cost them everything, hit that like button, because this one's for you." The Peel Region Courthouse outside Toronto has this particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the radiators. Marble floors, fluorescent lights that hum just a little too loud, and a silence that makes every cough sound like an accusation. My father, Walter Hendricks, sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer he'd clearly bought specifically for this performance. His silver hair combed back like he was about to host a Rotary Club dinner instead of trying to throw his own daughter out of a house. He owned 3 car dealerships across the GTA. Hendricks Auto, the kind of name you'd see on a billboard off the 401 with his smiling, oversized face plastered next to a Ford F-150. For 30 years he'd built himself into a local legend, the self-made man, the guy who started with one used Honda lot in Mississauga and turned it into an empire. We were in court because he'd filed an emergency eviction notice against me, trying to force me out of the house on Bellevue Crescent, the home my late mother had left in trust, the home I'd been quietly living in for the past year while the rest of my family treated me like an embarrassment they kept meaning to clean up. His lawyer, a slick guy named Preston Cole, who billed by the 6-minute increment and clearly loved every one of them, was pacing in front of the bench like he was auditioning for a legal drama. "Mr. Hendricks, walk us through why you've had to take this drastic step against your own daughter." My father sighed like a man carrying the weight of the world. "I love Marguerite, Your Honor. But there comes a point where tough love is the only thing left. I let her stay in the Bellevue house out of pure generosity. Instead, she's squatting there, refusing to contribute a dime, holding up my plans to list the property." He let out a short, mocking laugh. "And on her salary, she works as a receptionist at a dental office. She couldn't afford a bachelor apartment in Brampton, let alone maintain a house like that." I didn't react. I sat very still next to my own lawyer, my hands folded in my lap. Behind me in the gallery I could hear my younger brother Desmond snickering quietly with his wife Priya. Desmond was 32, drove a leased BMW he couldn't actually afford, and worked, allegedly, as some kind of investment consultant, which as far as I could tell meant he forwarded other people's stock tips to his Instagram followers. Priya was a corporate paralegal at a downtown firm, the kind of woman who corrected your grammar at family dinners and called it just being honest. They'd come to watch the family disappointment finally get what was coming to her. What none of them knew, what I had spent 3 years making absolutely sure none of them knew, was that the receptionist job was a cover. I had quietly built a private lending firm called Northwind Capital, the kind that buys up distressed commercial debt for pennies on the dollar. While they were spending money they didn't have, I'd spent 3 years buying up the debts of the very people my father bragged about at his Rotary dinners. The judge, a sharp older woman named Justice Okonkwo, looked over her glasses at my father. "Mr. Hendricks, if your daughter's situation is as dire as you say, why was her trust fund frozen 10 years ago?" My father straightened up, proud of the question, the way he always got proud whenever he had a chance to talk about himself. "Because I refused to fund rebellion, Your Honor. 10 years ago, I'd arranged a very advantageous match for Marguerite, the son of my biggest business partner, a respectable young man who could have secured her future. She refused, walked away from her responsibilities. So I cut her off, to teach her a lesson about reality." He left out the part where that respectable young man had grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark the one time I'd pushed back, and that the marriage would have conveniently bailed my father out of a bad land deal. He left out the panic attacks. He left out the year I couldn't leave my apartment without my hands shaking. Preston Cole waved a paper dramatically. "As you can see, Your Honor, my client is the sole registered owner of the Bellevue property. We've followed the proper Ontario notice procedure to the letter. The defendant has ignored it entirely. We're asking the court to grant the eviction today." Justice Okonkwo studied the paper, then looked at me. Mrs. Hendricks, your father says you're refusing to vacate his property and that you have no means to support yourself. Do you have anything to say? I looked at the document on the screen. It was an exact copy of the one that had started this whole war. I knew it intimately. I didn't look at the judge. I turned my head and met my father's eyes across the courtroom, and I let a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. To understand how we got to that courtroom, with my father standing on the edge of a trap he didn't know he'd walked into, you have to go back exactly 1 week. Back to Thanksgiving dinner at the Bellevue house, where the first shot of this whole thing got fired. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey and simmering resentment in equal measure. My father sat at the head of the table like he was presiding over a board meeting, Desmond and Priya to his right, Priya's diamond tennis bracelet catching the light every time she reached for the gravy, a bracelet I happened to know my father had put on his dealership's corporate visa. I sat at the far end, the designated disappointment, the daughter who'd ruined her life a decade ago by refusing to marry well. For most of dinner they ignored me completely. Desmond bragged about a crypto position that was about to 10x. Priya dropped phrases like due diligence and fiduciary duty into a conversation about cranberry sauce, just to remind everyone she had a law degree, even if it was only a paralegal certificate from Seneca College. I ate quietly and watched their performance of wealth, knowing full well Desmond's BMW lease was 11 days past due, and Priya's firm had quietly let her go 3 weeks earlier, something she hadn't told anyone, including apparently her own husband. Then my father decided it was time for the main event. He wiped his mouth, reached into his blazer, and tossed a folded legal document across the table. It landed on my plate, the corner soaking up gravy. A sharp giggle from Priya broke the silence. My father's eyes were flat and cold. You've overstayed your welcome, Marguerite. You contribute nothing. I have a buyer interested in Bellevue and I need it cleared. You've got 72 hours to pack up your junk and get off my property. Desmond leaned back, swirling his rye and ginger like he was at a board meeting. Let's be objective here, sis. 37-year-old women without a career don't get to live rent-free in a 4-bedroom house in Mississauga. You had years to figure your life out. Instead, you answer phones for a living. He pulled a $50 bill from his wallet, slid it across the table next to the gravy-soaked notice. Here, put it toward a U-Haul. Consider it a charitable donation from a guy who's actually built something. Priya chimed in, resting her hand on his arm like they were a unified front of 2 people who could barely cover their own minimum payments. He's being incredibly generous, Marg. Dad's let you freeload for a year. Time to grow up. I looked at the eviction notice sitting in my food, I looked at the $50 on the table, and then I did the one thing none of them expected. I smiled. I picked up the notice, wiped the gravy off the corner with my napkin, and set it neatly beside my water glass. I ignored the money entirely. I took a slow bite of turkey and chewed. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. They'd been waiting for tears. Instead, I swallowed, took a sip of water, and looked directly at my father. You're liquidating assets to cover a margin call, I said evenly. The room went dead silent. My father blinked, caught off guard by the financial language coming out of my mouth. Which means, I continued, the Aaron Mills expansion is dead. You missed the floor plan financing renewal on the Mississauga lot back in September. Your inventory's been sitting on a curtailment notice for 2 months, and TD pulled your line of credit last Tuesday. His face went the color of wet ash. Desmond stopped swirling his drink. Priya looked between her husband and her father-in-law, completely lost. How, my father said quietly, would you know that? I picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip, holding his terrified stare over the rim. For 10 years he'd controlled the story. He was the self-made titan of GTA used car lots, and I was the unstable daughter who couldn't hold a job. Now I'd just dismantled his entire financial facade between bites of turkey. Before he could recover, Priya slammed her glass down. You're playing a very dangerous game, Marguerite, she said, putting on her best boardroom voice. I don't know what internet sleuthing you've been doing from your little receptionist desk, but making defamatory claims about Hendricks Auto is grounds for a lawsuit. Public dealer floor financing records aren't defamation, Priya. They're public record with Vic. Priya pointed a manicured finger at me. You listen to me. If you push this to a judge, I will personally make sure every panic attack you had at 26 gets read into the court record. Every prescription, every therapy bill. We'll have you declared incapable and Dad appointed your guardian. You won't even be able to open a checking account without his signature. 10 years earlier, that threat would have flattened me. Now, I just looked at her. I reached out, picked up the embossed business card she'd tossed onto the table at some point during her tirade, Sterling Wycliffe LLP, and turned it over in my fingers. Sterling Wycliffe, I read aloud. Prestigious firm. I hear congratulations are in order. The merger talk with Whitfield Partners is finally moving forward. Priya's face changed. What merger? The one your managing partners have been negotiating quietly for 2 months. Word on Bay Street is the junior associates are first on the chopping block once the books get combined. I set the card down gently. I'm sure a brilliant paralegal like yourself has nothing to worry about. Although, didn't they let you go 3 weeks ago? Priya went white. Desmond turned to stare at her. What is she talking about? You got let go. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and looked at my father, who was still gripping the edge of the table. I won't be signing your notice, Dad. I'll see you and your lawyer in court. I walked out through the front hall, my boots loud against the hardwood, and stepped into the brutal late November Toronto cold. The wind cut straight through my coat, but I'd never felt warmer. In my car, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a contact saved simply as M, and hit call. It picked up on the first ring. "Evening, Ms. Hendricks," said my portfolio manager Felix, his voice crisp. "Felix, it's time. Activate the Hendricks file. I want Northwind to acquire every defaulted floor plan note tied to Hendricks Auto and find me the second mortgage he took on Bellevue." There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking. "Already pulled it. It's a disaster, frankly. He's overleveraged across all 3 lots. His primary lenders flagged the notes non-performing, and there's a curtailment default that's been sitting for 60 days. We can buy the paper for cents on the dollar through the distressed desk." "Buy all of it," I said, pulling my coat tighter as I paced the icy driveway. "I want the floor plan debt, the equipment leases, the deed to every patch of dirt he calls a dealership, and I especially want that second mortgage on Bellevue. He used Priya's signature as guarantor on it. I want that paper in our vault before the banks open Monday." For a decade, my father had sold this town a story. The self-made titan, the guy who shook every hand at the Streetsville Chamber of Commerce dinner, the face on the billboard. He'd built it on debt and arrogance and used my anxiety as a leash to keep me quiet so nobody would look too closely at his books. While I was still on the phone, my screen lit up with a text from Priya, a 10-second video. I pressed play. Shaky footage, my old bedroom at Bellevue, Priya's mean little laugh as the soundtrack. The camera panned to my father and Desmond standing in front of my closet, ripping clothes off hangers. "Looks like the freeloader forgot to pack," my father said in the video, grinning. Desmond grabbed my winter parka, the good one, the one that actually survives a Canadian January, and hurled it out the second-floor window into the slush below. The clip ended on Priya's face. "Have fun at a motel, loser." I stood in the driveway looking down at a coat I'd need in about 6 weeks when it actually got cold, lying in a frozen puddle a few houses away. A version of me 10 years younger would have collapsed right there in the snow. Instead, I felt nothing but a clean, cold calm. "You still there?" Felix asked. "I'm here," I said. "Change of plans. I need you to pull the books on a law firm downtown." Sterling Wycliffe. By Monday morning, Northwind had quietly bought the firm's operating line of credit and the master lease on their Bay Street office. We would, functionally, become Sterling Wycliffe's shadow landlord and its largest creditor, with full leverage over who stayed and who got cut in the coming restructuring. 3 days later, a courier dropped a manila envelope at the dental office where I supposedly answered phones. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement and a cashier's check for $2,000. The note, in Desmond's handwriting, said it was in exchange for signing away my share of our late grandmother's jewelry, the one untouched asset left in the family trust, the one that needed both our signatures to liquidate. I met Desmond at a Tim Hortons on Dundas the next morning. He showed up in a tailored coat that cost more than his last 3 lease payments combined, slid the envelope across the table, and told me with real condescension that I had no money, no home, and absolutely no leverage. He threatened the same thing Priya had: therapy records, a guardianship application. The works. I didn't touch the envelope. I reached into my bag and slid a single sheet across the table instead. Northwind letterhead, a black geometric falcon logo at the top. "What is this?" he muttered. "An internal memo generated about 20 minutes ago. Should be in Priya's old firm's inbox by now, too." I watched the color drain out of his face as he read it. "Sterling Wycliffe's merger fell through this morning. Northwind bought out their credit line at 8 a.m. We also hold the master lease on their office. As of today, I'm the new primary stakeholder dictating who stays." He looked up, his hand visibly shaking. You can't do this. I'm liquidating their staffing model by Friday. I leaned forward, and while we're on the subject, I'd be careful bringing up billable hours, Desmond. Funny thing, Priya's old timesheets. October the 9th, she billed 11 hours of file review the same afternoon she was at the Cartier counter in Yorkdale buying a bracelet. I have the receipts lined up against the timestamps. She's been padding hours for 2 years to fund a lifestyle neither of you can afford. He went rigid. His phone buzzed on the table, an email notification, subject line, immediate termination of employment, sender the managing partner. I hadn't even needed to send it myself. Felix's team had it queued the moment the takeover cleared. You ruined me, he said, voice cracking. You ruined yourself, I said, standing, sliding my bag over my shoulder. I just turned the lights on. 3 weeks later, we sat in a glass-walled conference room downtown for the mandatory pretrial mediation, a step Ontario requires before a residential eviction goes in front of a judge. My father walked in wearing a navy blazer instead of his usual flash, trying to look like the long-suffering, reasonable parent. Beside him sat a new lawyer, Preston Cole, a shark known for burying people in paperwork. My lawyer, Owen Marsh, didn't look like much. Rumpled tweed jacket, wire glasses, a battered leather satchel instead of a briefcase. Cole wasted no time sliding a settlement agreement across the table, full release of any claim to the family trust, including the jewelry, in exchange for my father dropping the eviction. I pushed it back. I'm not signing anything, and I'm certainly not handing over my grandmother's jewelry to fund Hendricks Auto's collapse. My father's eyes went cold. You always were stubborn. Cole popped open his briefcase and slid across a red folder, fabricated damage reports for $50,000 in destruction at Bellevue, sworn affidavits from staff who didn't exist, the threat of criminal vandalism charges if I didn't sign. Owen cleared his throat softly and ignored the folder entirely. He pulled out a single thin file instead. Mr. Hendricks, can you explain the $2 million equity loan registered against the Bellevue property on the 14th of last month? All the color drained from my father's face. The loan itself isn't the issue, Owen continued mildly. It's the routing. The funds moved straight into a numbered company registered in Barbados, North Shore Holdings, and Bellevue is part of an irrevocable family trust. You can't borrow against it without every living beneficiary's signature. I never signed anything. Cole turned to his client. Walter, what is this? You told me the property was clean. My father couldn't answer. Priya, who'd been sitting at the far end of the table painting her nails with a clear topcoat, finally looked up. What $2 million loan? Turn to page 4, I said, sliding the file down the table to her. Look below the signature. Tell me what you see. She stared at it. That's my signature. I never signed this. I don't even know what North Shore Holdings is. Her eyes went wide and wet. We're closing on the new build in Oakville next week. The bank's running our final credit check tomorrow. You don't have a credit check anymore, I said quietly. Your file's anchored to a defaulted $2 million offshore loan under active investigation. Desmond's also no longer employed, as of about an hour ago. There's nothing left to close on. Cole stood up, snapped his briefcase shut. You lied to me, Walter. You swore the chain of title was clean. I'm withdrawing as counsel, effective immediately. He walked out without another word. My father grabbed Priya's wrist and dragged her toward the door, screaming that he'd hire a dozen lawyers, that he'd drag this through the courts until I was old and gray. He had no idea the actual trial would be a slaughter. 3 weeks after that, we sat in the wood-paneled courtroom at the Peel Region Courthouse. My father had hired a replacement lawyer named Marcus Thorne, the kind of guy who specializes in cases nobody respectable will touch. On the stand, my father gave the performance of his life. The long-suffering father, the daughter who'd isolated herself, the tough love that was breaking his heart to dispense. He claimed a net worth comfortably over $15 million. Owen stood, walked toward him with nothing but a single sheet of paper, and asked him to confirm the figure under oath. Then he laid out the receivables, one by one. The curtailment defaults at all 3 dealerships, the second mortgage funneled offshore, the vendor invoices going unpaid in Brampton, Mississauga, and Oakville. You don't have a net worth of $15 million, Mr. Hendricks, Owen said. You're closer to $9 million underwater. You are not a wealthy provider. You are functionally insolvent. The courtroom went still. My father's face turned a deep, mottled red. I had dinner with my regional director at TD last week, he insisted. We have an understanding. They know I'm good for it. Which bank, Mr. Hendricks? Owen asked, his voice dropping. Because TD sold your entire commercial book yesterday morning. Justice Okonkwo took the new filing from Owen, reviewed it carefully, page by page. The color drained out of the room along with whatever was left of my father's confidence. "So your family genuinely has no idea," she said finally, looking at my father with something close to pity. "No idea about what, Your Honor?" Thorne stammered. "She's the one who holds the mortgage on his dealership." Justice Okonkwo set the file down. "Miss Hendricks is the principal of Northwind Capital. As of 3 days ago, Northwind holds the senior secured position on Hendricks Auto's entire commercial debt, and as a result of an unpaid second mortgage on the Bellevue property itself." My father stopped breathing. His mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. Owen stood, calm as ever. "For the record, Your Honor, Mr. Hendricks defaulted on his floor plan financing in September. TD sold the distressed book to Northwind Capital, which exercised its rights and foreclosed on Bellevue to satisfy the outstanding debt 3 days ago. My client is the sole legal owner of the property. The plaintiff cannot evict the landlord. In fact, Mr. Hendricks is currently trespassing on property owned by Northwind Capital. We request the eviction be dismissed with prejudice." My father sat frozen, staring at the man he used to be reflected back at him in everyone's faces, the gallery, the reporters scribbling in the second row, even his own collapsed lawyer. He'd spent 30 years building an empire on borrowed money and louder confidence than anyone around him, and the daughter he'd thrown into the street 10 years ago had quietly bought the ground out from under him. "This is a fraud," he spat, standing. "Some shell company she invented to delay these proceedings. It's a numbered Ontario corporation registered 5 years ago, Mr. Hendricks," Justice Okonkwo said flatly. "Properly licensed, properly filed with FSRA. Your unfamiliarity with who buys distressed debt on the open market is not this court's problem." I stood, walked to the center of the courtroom, and handed the bailiff a single sheet of paper to give to my father. "10 years ago," I said, my voice even, "you put me out into a November rainstorm because I wouldn't marry a man you'd picked to bail out a bad land deal. You told me I'd be back within a week, begging." "Cole." "Sorry, Thorne," half rose to object. The judge waved him down without even looking. "You told me family protects family. Where was that the night I stood on your porch in the rain and you locked the door?" My father's eyes were wet now, his jaw working. "I was preparing you for the real world." "You're holding a 24-hour notice of eviction," I said. "Get out of my house." He was gone from the property within the day, escorted by movers and a deputy bailiff, while Desmond stood on the lawn arguing with a tow truck driver about a leased BMW that was about to be repossessed. Priya filed for divorce inside a month. The provincial and CRA investigation into the offshore mortgage moved fast once Owen's office forwarded the file. My father was charged with mortgage fraud under the criminal code within 6 weeks, his dealer licenses suspended by OM Vayek pending the outcome. 3 months later, I stood in the renovated living room at Bellevue, the late winter light coming soft through windows that used to be hung with heavy, oppressive drapes my father had chosen specifically because they made the room feel important. I'd stripped the house of every trace of him, the leather club chairs, the oil paintings of men who looked like they'd never apologized for anything in their lives, and replaced it all with something that actually felt like a home. The local news was playing quietly on the television, my father's mugshot under a banner about fraud charges and a hearing date. I clicked it off without much feeling either way. That night was the inaugural fundraiser for the Northwind Women's Fund, a program we'd built to give emergency legal and financial support to women untangling themselves from family members who treat them like assets instead of people. Forged signatures, frozen accounts, the threat of being declared incompetent used as a leash. Owen handed me a glass of wine on the back patio, told me the silent auction had already cleared $60,000, and I stepped out onto the porch alone for a minute before going back in. This was the exact spot where I'd stood 10 years earlier with nothing but a duffel bag and a coat that didn't fit right, begging a locked door to open. I thought about every family dinner where I'd been the punchline, every time someone called my anxiety a character flaw instead of what it actually was. And I thought about how nobody ever tells you that the way out isn't an argument. It's patience and a number in a bank account and the willingness to wait exactly as long as it takes. You don't negotiate with people who only see you as something to be managed. You don't wait around for an apology that was never coming. You build your own ground to stand on, quietly, for as long as it takes, and then one day you simply own the place they thought they could put you out of. Have you ever had to set a hard, uncompromising line with family just to protect your own future? Tell me in the comments, and remember, the version of you they underestimated is usually the one keeping the receipts.